key here. As Dinesh mentioned, we met actually about a year and a half ago when we invited him to speak at an event we'd organised on using evidence-based policy in Delhi. So the work we've been doing is being undertaken by what is now Campbell South Asia, so it's a regional centre of Campbell based in Delhi. Denny John and one of the staff there has been working most closely with the national team, Peter and the others. But Peter Saran, who prepares some of the slides that we're presenting, is our evidence mapping expert. So evidence maps I'm going to talk about in general, using some examples from the road safety map, are part of what I call the evidence revolution. So I just want to draw attention to tweet. I'll put the Twitter things up there. And when I talk about evidence revolution, and I'll say a bit about evidence revolution in health as I go on, because in health is where the evidence revolution is best embedded already. When I speak about evidence revolution, I use the word revolution on purpose, because a revolution means we change the world. And the evidence revolution is about changing the world, changing the way we do policy and practice, to make policy and practice really based on evidence. And what we see in the evidence revolution is the growing use of evidence across all sectors, not just health. So just over a year ago, US Congress passed the Evidence-Based Policy Act. In the US now you have many evidence-based programs where budgets are set that have to be spent on what are evidence-based programs. Programs have been proven by, usually by randomized controlled trials. And under the Evidence-Based Act, Policy-Making Act in the US, all major programs at state level have to be subject to rigorous impact analysis. My own background is in staff development. The US Non-Profit International Committee committed itself by this year, all of its programs to be evidence-based, or where there's no evidence for a program in an area, they will use that program to collect evidence about its effectiveness. And finally, and I'll talk more about the example in a moment, in the UK, in England, where we have what's called the What Works movement, 2/3 of schools across England use evidence from systematic reviews to decide how to allocate school resources on what to teach in the classroom. 2/3 of schools use evidence from reviews to inform decision making. That's an enormous change to 10 years ago. The problem in saying when you use the evidence is simply knowing where to find that evidence given the information overload. So based on a search, I won't go into details, but based on a search on Google, I estimate there are around 20 million publications on road safety since 1990. Okay, it's between 19 and 26 million depending on what you do. This blue line shows the actual numbers coming up in the search, but there's an indexing issue, there always is on databases. So if you extrapolate rather than take the actual numbers, you get around 26 million papers on road safety published since 1990. So when we say to policymakers, oh look at the evidence, they can say, well there are 26 million papers, what do you want me to do? So that's the whole point about evidence synthesis. That's the whole point of Cochrane, which many of you working have know. That's the whole point of Campbell. Is we take those 26 million papers and we say, well here's a map of what you need to be looking at, or here are reviews based on the relevant evidence. And evidence synthesis is basically the key point in what I call the evidence architecture. So this is my knowledge brokering pyramid. It's in a paper I published in Nature last year on the evidence revolution. And the key part of the evidence revolution are the top 3 layers: evidence portals, guidelines, and checklists. So for those who are working in health, which is many of you in public health, you're used to a system based on guidelines. So WHO, national agencies like NICE in the UK, like SBU here in Stockholm, produce guidelines on health. And those guidelines are based on systematic reviews. WHO has guidelines on producing guidelines, and in terms of guidelines on guidelines, say that WHO guidelines have to be based on high quality systematic reviews. So that's the point of having evidence-based products at the top of the evidence pyramid to inform decision making, but based on high quality reviews. And Most of it are based on guidelines, but the What Works movement, which has taken hold in the UK and the US, the What Works movement is based on evidence portals. So the biggest and best evidence portal is what's called the Teaching and Learning Toolkit, done by the Education Endowment Foundation for England. I call this the best website in the world. I quite like it, obviously. So the best website in the world is the Teaching and Learning Toolkit of the EEF in England, and they have 32 different interventions to improve the learning outcomes of disadvantaged children in schools. And for each of those 32 interventions, they commission a systematic review. Currently not Campbell reviews, but they will be in due course, we're working on that. And in the toolkit, we have 3 metrics. One is the cost, is it a cheap intervention or an expensive one? One is the strength of the evidence, lots of high quality RCTs, or just a few before and after studies. And finally, the impact. And the impact means the month's additional learning outcomes a child gets to be exposed to this intervention. So if you include arts participation in your curriculum, it's as if the child gets an additional 2 months schooling. Having arts participation is good for learning outcomes. You can sort by that metric, and you can see that giving a child feedback on their work is very low cost, quite good evidence. It's equivalent to 8 months additional learning. Giving a child feedback on their work is really good in improving learning outcomes and very cheap to do. You can reverse sort and see that repeating a year, not common in England, it's common in the US and other countries, costs a lot of money, is actually harmful for the child's learning outcomes. It sets them back by 4 months. So it's because of this tool that we have, according to the National Learning Office report from 2015, 5 years ago, 2/3 of schools using evidence from reviews to inform decision making. Not because teachers or head teachers are reading reviews, they don't know what a systematic review is, but because of this. And you can drill down and learn more about the intervention. You can drill down and read the review if you want to, but you don't have to, because this tool alone is sufficient to allow evidence-based decisions to be made without the decision maker having to look at the evidence. And that's the key part about the top 3 layers of the evidence knowledge broker or evidence pyramid, is that decision makers use evidence, using evidence-based decision tools without having to look at the evidence itself. But of course, to build the top of the pyramid, you need to have the bottom of the pyramid. I've spoken to funders who have said, oh yes, we'd like to do evidence-based guidelines, and I've said, yes, but we do need the evidence to do the evidence-based guidelines, someone needs to fund that. And so what evidence maps do is to tell us the current state of the base of the pyramid. That's the point from the evidence map. You say, okay, we want to do the top layers, but what's the base of the pyramid look like? So when we at Campbell work with various What Works centres in the UK, which we do with the new centres, we start by saying, well, let's do an evidence map to see what's out there. Then we can decide where you've got high quality reviews already, so you can go and do guidelines or portals, or where you need to do reviews, because lots of studies with no reviews, or where you actually need to be doing primary studies. So an evidence and gap map tends to be presented as a matrix. This is one we've just completed with UNICEF on violence against children, and in the map you have different interventions you can do to reduce violence against children in the rows, and the columns different outcomes. These are violence prevention outcomes. And in each cell you have a bubble, or a series of bubbles. The size of the bubbles represents the number of studies, and the colouring scheme, you can do whatever you want, but this colouring scheme is based on critical appraisal of the studies, basically what confidence can we have in study findings based on some design features. So we'll see an example in a moment using the road safety map. So an evidence and gap map, an EGM, is a systematic presentation of all relevant studies. Now, what constitutes relevant studies depends on your research question. You can do an evidence map of qualitative research, no problem. But most evidence and gap maps are maps of effectiveness studies or intervention studies, meaning studies that ask the question, does this intervention work? Meaning, does it make a difference to the outcomes of interest? So what we're interested to do in the road safety map is to say, what studies out there actually evaluate the impact of different interventions on the road safety outcomes of deaths and injuries. And the intermediate outcomes of behaviour like speed, wearing helmets, wearing seatbelts, and so on. And so that's what we map in the road safety map. It's effectiveness studies and reviews of effectiveness studies. So, warning, the maps tell you what evidence is out there, they don't tell you what the evidence says. That's the next step. It's okay, now we've got no evidence there, what does it tell us? So here is a snapshot of one corner of the map. It's bigger than this. And so you see the outcomes I mentioned, the primary outcomes of crashes and non-fatal injury crashes, and then the various intermediate outcomes that we coded. And here's the first set of intervention categories. We'll hear more about them later on. Different sessions will present different intervention categories in the map. In this map, the blue bubble is primary studies and the green bubble is reviews. And so the bigger the bubble, the more studies there are. And we'll see that in a second. Now, in the mapping software we use, based on probability review, adjusted mapping reviews, you can actually present the axes according to whatever you code. If you code a variable, you can present the map according to that variable. Okay, so that's not the next slide. Coming in a moment. So it's on this map, outcomes going across the top. I explained already, interventions going down the rows. Now, we can change the column and row headings. So in this map, we've got the same interventions, but the column headings are now regions. So what we see is over 90% of the studies come from North America. So get ready to tweet this, please. So over 90% of road deaths are in low-middle income countries, but 90% of the evidence comes from North America. Okay, I'll say it again so you can tweet it. Yes, over 90% of road deaths are in low-middle income countries, but over 90% of the evidence comes from North America. So when Dinesh spoke his opening remarks about it's different in Vietnam, 90% of traffic is motorbikes. It's different in China, it's different in India because of the weak enforcement and regulatory environment. So the type of interventions that work in those contexts will not necessarily be the same interventions that work in North America. But how many studies do we have from South Asia, but in these areas, actually none, go down the map we'll find some, from Sub-Saharan Africa, one Green's reviews, one review covering Sub-Saharan Africa, but no primary studies. So in these areas, there are no studies, even though that's where most road deaths are taking place. So these maps, these online maps, are interactive maps, which is why people like them a lot. So you can hover over a cell, like the impact enforcement of crashes, and see how many studies there are, 100 impact evaluations, 90 reviews. You can click on the cell and get a list of all those studies. So there's one by Rune at the top there. And you can click on any study, so you click on this study, and you get an access to a database record, which currently is just showing the link. So you click on the link to the article, and you get to the article of the abstract that's not in public domain. So the maps don't just show you what's there, they actually allow you to access the research. So we've got in this map 935 studies, of which 96 systematic reviews and 839 are primary studies, and you can access them through the map. So you can click on the cell, click on the list of contents, click on the study, and it takes you to the article. So it's not just saying it's there, it's allowing you to access the evidence. So they're seen as a useful research tool to actually take people to find the research. So what's the use of the map? So it does increase discoverability of that evidence. Now, what's the evidence on road safety? Well, here it is, 935 articles, you can access them through this map. And we want to promote effectiveness as an area of research. So we heard some derogatory comments about elderly white men a little while ago, but they're elderly people, all colour and gender working on this. Okay? Men and women, different colours, but all elderly working on this. The neighbour keeps telling me, that road safety is not a sexy area anymore. The younger researchers are not doing road safety. If I look around the room, maybe it's sort of more or less true. So we want to promote road safety as an area that's actually an important thing to work on, and particularly effective studies in low middle income countries. That's what we'd like to see. We identified groups of studies where we do reviews, that's what Campbell's interested in. We identify, of course, areas where there are gaps, which is low middle income countries, where more primary studies are needed. And we do identify where there are reviews already, there are 96 reviews in the map, where we might be able to draw out some conclusions. Though the reviews themselves may say the existing evidence is quite weak or low quality. I would point out that one of the motivations Dinesh had to do this map was to say that randomised controlled trials are now seen as a gold standard in evaluation, and RCT has been done in many more areas than we thought possibly. Before Campbell, I ran an organisation called the National Institute for Impact Evaluation, 3IE, where we funded around 200 evaluations of development programmes. About 80% of our grants were to randomised controlled trials of governance programmes, of environmental programmes, and so on. So you can do RCTs across a whole range of different types of intervention, and certainly many of the things we do on road safety would be amenable to randomisation. Some of them, but some aren't. The most common design is what we call controlled before after. Controlled is known to me, it doesn't mean there's a control group, it just means before versus after study. And we've had a lot of discussion in the research group about which before versus after designs are valid estimates of impact. Because generally, when we do a Campbell review, we'd say before after designs are not allowed, because of course they're confounding factors that change over time. But in some of these studies, it's sort of very plausible that the intervention is the cause of the effect. And so I actually think our course should probably have an independent working group on saying which before versus after designs seem to be okay or not, with some clear criteria. We don't like ad hoc or post hoc rationalisation in Campbell. We want to have clear criteria ex ante. And we worked with this, we were sort of going, yeah, this one's in, this one's not sure why, but it just feels right. That's not the way we like things. We want to have clear rules. So, where do we go from here? Well, here's the map just showing reviews. I'm taking up time to study. You can filter the map by various characteristics. So I filter by study design. And here's an example of a review. And here's an example where we have 23 studies, but actually most of them aren't very good quality. So based on that, we think training is a good thing. Mental health training, we think is a good thing. We can't on the basis of the evidence say which type of training is best, basically. We think it's a good thing, mainly because requiring it stops unlicensed people getting on the road. We don't find any effect of the training itself. So the next steps for us are basically that. We're working on completing the map, and during the day, you'll hear different people talking about evidence coming from different parts of the map. So you have plenty of opportunity to discuss with the people who worked on the map, which is not really me, on how the map can be constructed, what we include, what we didn't include, and so on, and to guide us in our future directions, which definitely include doing more reviews where reviews are lacking and publishing those reviews with Campbell. There are reviews, but we've got the data, often quite specific, and we'd like to have sort of broader coverage reviews across the areas in the map. So thank you. If you want to know more about Campbell, please visit our website. We do have a paper on evidence mapping per se, quite a few years ago, so you can read that. I'm here all day, so happy to answer any questions.